Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Susanna Blume. I'm a Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Defense Program here at CNAS. And we are gathered here today to talk about how the U.S. military fights wars today, but more importantly, in the future. And I hope that you will indulge me in a slightly longer than usual preamble here, because I think it's important for us all to know what it is that we're talking about, and particularly why these three gentlemen to my left are here to talk about it. And so we start, as I almost always do at these events, with the National Defense Strategy. It clearly defined the Pentagon's top priority as competition and potential conflict with China and Russia. And effectively, what the NDS did was change the ends of U.S. defense strategy. And it also implied that the Department of Defense would also have to change the ways it approaches these new ends. But to date, much of the discussion about the NDS is actually focused on the means. It's focused on how much money is in the defense budget. Are we buying X instead of Y? What do we need to shift? What do we need to move? And as you all know, this is actually what I spend most of my time talking about. It's a very important and worthy topic. But we've to date kind of missed this discussion about the ways, about that step two in the ends, ways, means paradigm. And so CNAS, and specifically our newest senior fellow in the defense program, Chris Dougherty, is launching a project to address this shortcoming. And it's called A New American Way of War. We like to call it ANOWAL for short, because you got to have a zippy acronym, right? And his hypothesis is basically that the shift in strategy is profound enough that we have to fundamentally rethink the way that we fight, and that this thinking about the way that we fight should also inform what we buy and how much is enough. So that's the thesis of the project. And joining me here today to shed some light on this subject and to launch this new project that we're undertaking here are really the two dons of American force planning, in Bob Work and Dave Ochmanek. I knew you were going to hate that, so I didn't tell you about it in advance.
There's one don and one acolyte. How about that?
Okay. And Chris himself, who is one of the foremost next-generation thinkers in this space. So Chris, as I mentioned, is a senior fellow here, and he's the mastermind of this A New American Way of War project. Prior to coming to CNAS, he worked in the Office of Strategy and Force Development in the Pentagon, and was a key drafter of the 2018 National Defense Strategy. What we like to say is that he wrote the pointy bits, which is a fun characterization of his role in that process. During his time in the Pentagon before and previously at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, Chris also assessed the ability of the military to meet its strategic ambitions and worked on new operational concepts designed to meet the demands of deterring China and Russia. Bob, as many of you know, is a senior counselor and distinguished senior fellow also here at CNAS. Prior to that role, he served as the Deputy Secretary of Defense, where his work leading the third offset was in many ways an important lead and a precursor to what eventually became the NDS. It was a very influential bit of strategy and planning. But beyond the formal titles, Bob was a preeminent visionary in the U.S. defense strategy and force planning space, beginning in his time in the Office of Net Assessment and through 10 years at CSBA, and then previously here as the CEO of CNAS. He's consistently been looking, 20 years and beyond into the future, diagnosing critical military competitions, and coming up with innovative concepts and strategies for meeting those. Dave is a senior international and defense researcher at the RAND Corporation. He has interspersed his time at RAND with 2 stints as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. First as the DASD for Strategy, 1993 to 1995, and then again as the DASD for Force Development from 2009 to 2014. And in those roles, he played a really critical role in shaping U.S. post-Cold War U.S. defense strategy, particularly emphasizing the size, the shape, the readiness of the joint force. But again, more important than those official titles is that Dave is a preeminent analyst. I'm going to flatter you some more. Just get ready. But preeminent analyst of force planning in the U.S. And his ideas and methods have influenced really every major strategy review or shift in the size and shape, the composition of the joint force since the end of the Cold War, up to and including the National Defense Strategy. So that's who these three august guests here with me today are. And that's why we selected these specific panelists to come and talk about this topic. And so without further ado, I'm going to dive right in. I'm going to give the first question to Chris, and I'm going to ask him to define some terms for us. So what is a way of war? How is it different from official doctrine or operational concepts? Why does it matter?
Absolutely, it's a great question. There's been a lot of writing on the American way of war in particular, and I think each scholar who's delved into that question has defined it slightly differently. Russell Wiley kind of originated the term, had his own definition. I know Tullia Echeverria, who I believe was RSVP for this event, I don't know if you're here, defined it as American way of battle. There's been different kinds of ways of thinking about it. The way I see it and the way this project is going to approach it is as a common set of assumptions and expectations about how war unfolds and what war looks like. And Carl Bilder in his book, his kind of masterful book, Masks of War, called it the image of conflict. If you close your eyes and in your mind's eye you see how a war unfolds, that narrative structure about what it looks like and how it unfolds informs the way you plan operationally. And this manifests itself, I think, in the joint force and in our military thinkers in the template that we approach military problems with. And that template, you can see it, I think, most clearly if you do a lot of wargaming. You sit a joint planner down or a service planner down in front of a wargaming or any kind of operational problem, and generally speaking, the solution is within a 90% the same every single time. And that template that they're bringing with them, that is the way of war that we bring with us. And it informs doctrine and informs our concepts, but it's a little bit more soaked into the marrow of our thinking than official writing.
Yeah. Robert, Dave, do you have anything to add?
I think that's good.
All right.
I was just going to say, I don't think the American way of war or a way of war is a static thing. I address it primarily through strategic culture, which is an imprecise term, but it's based on the geography of the power, the ingrained experience. So the United States, the ingrained experience is transoceanic power projection or counter-power projection. That's it. That is our ingrained experience. So everything we do, we fight in a away game, we have to get across two broad oceans to do it. The third thing is the overarching military regime, which changes. What is the way of war across all of the competitors, and who are the strategic competitors? And finally, strategic culture, you can see the value of human capital and technology, and the interplay of the two has a major impact on the way you think about how you would fight a war.
Okay. Bob, I think I'll stick with you for this next question here. What is the current American way of war, and how did it come about?
Well, the current American way of war is associated with a broad revolution in the overarching military regime, where we shifted broadly from unguided weapons warfare, which had an inherent bias towards mass, to a shift to guided munitions and battle networks, in which mass and how we thought about mass on the battlefield fundamentally changed. Geography is still a dominant factor, and over the current American way of war really occurred in a period where we were worried about transoceanic counter-power projection, protecting our allies, and we were shifting from a garrison posture in which we had large formations overseas in the theaters they were expected to fight, and we shifted to an expeditionary posture where we had fewer forces forward. So you started to have concepts like rapid halt and things like that. You had to somehow stop the power projection of your potential adversaries quickly. And our strategic competitors were all regional powers. It didn't really matter what our American way of war was. We would have crushed them like cockroaches once we assembled the might of America and went against them. And during this period, human capital and technology really was, how do we reduce casualties? We shifted to the all-volunteer force. The people are the critical discriminator of the United States military, in my view, and generally we thought of technology in terms of trying to reduce casualties and protect our most precious assets. But it's across the ocean, rapid halt, assemble your bases, what Frank Hoffman would call dominant maneuver. So I think right now we've had 25 years of extraordinarily favorable strategic circumstances. And from a strategic point of view, I know many of the people who have fought in wars will object to this, but from a historical and strategic point of view, it's been pretty easy for the United States to gain its military objectives. And, oh, by the way, I wanted to say, yes, against state adversaries. Today, we're really talking about conventional warfare against state adversaries. We can talk about gray zone operations and counterinsurgency, but really, to get the department to change right now, we're really saying, how would we fight a conventional state adversary?
Yeah. Dave?
Just a couple of things to add to that or underscore. Yes, so since the end of the Cold War, we were expeditionary. We don't have large forces deployed abroad in theaters where we're likely to fight. We deploy the force on warning of potential threats. We expect that force to be able to deploy to theater and to operate largely in sanctuary from enemy attack. And we are built around the belief, which has been founded in experience, that once the order is given to commence hostilities, U.S. forces will quickly gain dominance in all 5 domains of warfare, air, sea, land, space, and cyber, and exploit that dominance to achieve whatever objectives they're assigned. And of course, that's exactly where our adversaries are aiming their force development in order to deny us those key aspects of our way of war.
Thanks.
I think it's funny. I had 3 words written down to describe this, and there were time, sanctuary, and dominance, and you kind of took 2 of them right out of my mouth. But I think the time aspect, as it pertains to the problems and the challenges we face against China and Russia, really matter. Against non-nuclear armed opponents, right? A massive counterattack, and you look at 2003 against Hussein's Iraq, right? There is no escalation capability for Hussein's Iraq. They're just, we're going to come in, we're going to obliterate you, we're going to change your regime, and there's not a heck of a lot you can do about it.
Yeah.
And so time is really on the side of the United States. We have the flexibility to attack, as we've always said, and you hear this phrase all the time, it's become a cliche, at the time and place of our choosing. I don't think that situation obtains against new adversaries, and I think the other thing is that the ability to have escalation dominance against every rung on the ladder doesn't work when you're facing nuclear-armed opponents, and particularly an opponent like the Russians, who have a nuclear arsenal that is in many ways just as capable as ours. So I think that's another aspect of this, that we've kind of assumed that not only were our opponents regional adversaries, but they didn't have any meaningful means to escalate against us.
Yeah.
Point.
Yeah, so I think we're bleeding a little bit into my next question here, and I'll lead with Dave for this one. But so implied in this task that Chris has set for us is that we do need a new way of war.
Yes.
Why is that? So Chris also mentioned the criticality of wargaming. What have recent games revealed to us about the weaknesses of our current approach?
Well, the short answer, of course, is that in our games, when we fight China or Russia, and we've written about this in unclassified forms at RAND, Blue gets its ass handed to it. Not to put too fine a point on it. We lose a lot of people, we lose a lot of equipment, we usually fail to achieve our objective of preventing aggression by the adversary, which is a headline. So you pull, so you go home on vacation, you talk to your parents, your friends. Everyone assumes, based on 25 years of experience, that we have a dominant military establishment, that when we go to war we always win, we win big, and there isn't any question about this. And when you say to people, not so fast, they're shocked because they haven't had this experience. So why does that happen? A number of reasons. All 5 domains of warfare are contested from the outset of hostilities. We do not have air superiority over the battle space at the outset of these wars. We do not have maritime superiority. Our space assets are under attack with kinetic and non-kinetic means. Our command and control is under attack by electromagnetic attacks and cyber. The brain and the nervous system that connects all of these pieces is suppressed, if not shattered. And then finally, of course, our forward bases, whether at land or at sea, are under attack. So this notion of sanctuary that we deploy into and operate out from under is now gone in these wars. And we have yet to come to grips with what all that means.
Yeah. Chris, do you want to pile on?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I couldn't disagree with a single word that Dave has said. I think if you look at what he describes, I think the reason why we need a new way of war is that what he describes are systemic problems. So it's not just a onesie, twosie, I'm going to fix this widget or I'm going to change this concept for how I do air-based defense, and that's going to make everything better. I think when you add up the numbers of problems and you look at their breadth across domains, across services, and across functions, what you see is an inability to fix those piecemeal at anything approaching a reasonable defense budget. And so if you say that, okay, now I have to change almost everything, and I use that line from Giuseppe de Lampedusa has got this novel called The Leopard, and it's a story about the Italian Risorgimento and how the nobles needed to align themselves with the liberal revolution against the kingdom of the two Sicilies. And there's a great line there where he says, in order for things to stay the same, everything's got to change. And I think as a status quo power that kind of likes the situation that we're in as a country, we have to think as a military, if our level of advantage and dominance is going to remain over the next 30 years the way it has over the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War, we're going to have to really fundamentally change the way we fight wars.
Bob?
Yeah, I mean, what's so frustrating about this is the United States, in the 1990s, the Office of Net Assessment did a large series of war games called 20XX, and it essentially said, okay, right now we are dominant in the new operating regime. There's been a revolution in war. Guided munitions and battle networks at the operational level of war are going to, in large part, determine the pace, scope, and outcome of a campaign. Let's imagine 20 years hence when a large state adversary has achieved parity, which is what Andy Marshall would call a mature regime, where all of the competitors now have the same capabilities and scale, even if they pursue a couple of them asymmetrically. So if you take a look at the 6 operational challenges outlined in the 2001 QDR, those 6 operational challenges were informed by a decade of war games, which said, we are on the top of the hill right now, it really looks great, Desert Storm, Operation Allied Force, gosh, we're just going up against these regional pygmies. Everything looks good. What happens if it changes? And if you look at the 6 operational concepts outlined in the 2001 QDR, and had we pursued those, we'd be in a much, much different position right now against our strategic adversaries like Russia and China than we are. But of course, things happen. 9/11 happened just as the QDR was being published, and we went into a different direction. And so the biggest thing right now is we have a mature regime in which we have large state competitors that can match our scale. That's what's different. And so we have never gone up against an adversary with the same capabilities and scale in the guided munitions battle network regime. And look, people can say, oh, you're just talking about transformation work. And I say, no, look at what our competitors talk about. The Russians called them reconnaissance strike complex, and the Chinese called them operational systems. Everyone sees this exactly the same way. How do you win in this environment? And you will not win doing what Dave has described. You simply won't be able to do it. In every case that I know of, the F-35 rules the sky when it's in the sky, but it gets killed on the ground in large numbers. So in the first 5 days of the campaign, we're looking really good, but after the second 5 days, it's not looking so hot. Those are the things that the war games show over and over and over. And so we need a new American way of war without question.
So next I want to talk a little bit about, what should the elements of this new American way of war be, right? As Bob points out, people have been thinking about this on and off for some time now, and we should have some kind of inkling, at first blush of what direction we should be headed in. And I'm going to start with Dave and ask you to talk perhaps a little bit about the near term, 5 to 7 year outlook, and then go to Bob and ask you maybe to look a little bit further out than that.
Yeah. So, of course, we do war games not only as a way of giving a grade to the program of record, but also as a way of getting insights about the dynamics of these future campaigns and then testing hypotheses about how to fix the problems that the baseline games identify. We typically send our players home after 2 days quite depressed, again, because they got creamed. If we bring them back on day 3, we reset the clock to 0, and we say, let's try something else. Let me give you some new stuff, and let me encourage you to try some different ways of fighting. What seems to be working is things built around the following sort of ideas. One, U.S. forces need to be able to reach into the contested zone created by the enemy's A2AD capabilities from the outset of the campaign and engage and kill the operational center of gravity, whether it's amphibious ships coming across the Strait of Taiwan or battalion tactical groups coming across the borders of the Baltic states. Even with great improvements in our capabilities to suppress integrated air defenses, to defend bases, you are not going to have time to gain that dominance that you like to have, that we've become accustomed to, such that you can use direct attack weapons and non-stealthy platforms to go engage the enemy. It will not work. So figure out how to reach in and kill. 2, reduce the exposure of your force to the enemy's long-range fires. It will not work to put hundreds of airplanes within MRBM range of an adversary and expect those aircraft to generate combat power, whether they're at sea or whether they're on land. And unless and until we get a very significant breakthrough in the effectiveness and cost effectiveness of active defenses against ballistic missiles, we're going to have to live in that world. 3, maintain functioning kill chains. You got to have situational awareness on the battlefield. You got to know where the enemy is, and you have to apply the limited combat power you can bring to bear to the places where it matters most. And finally, having done that, and the strategy talks about the blunt phase of the blunt force to do this, you buy yourself some time to then start taking apart, dismantling the adversary's A2AD complex. His integrated air defenses, his command and control, his own eyes and ears. So in broad brush strokes, those are the 4 main elements that I think we're going to have to pursue if we're going to solve this problem. And I think it is not an intractable problem. There's stuff out there that would give us the wherewithal to do this.
Not an intractable problem even in the relatively near term.
Yes, even in the relatively near term.
Okay. Bob?
And we can amplify on that as we go along.
Yeah, let's do.
Yeah, once you have a mature regime, you're either going to try to gain an advantage in the regime against your competitor, you're going to try to look to change the name of the game and create a new regime. The hypothesis of the third offset was we're at that point that the United States should try to change the game. And in broad strokes, I'll say it was calling for a move towards algorithmic warfare, in which we truly exploit the advances in artificial intelligence and use them to have new ways of war with human-machine collaboration and human-machine combat teaming and assisted human operations, being able to call upon these new devices to help them gain a tactical advantage and to go after new types of autonomous weapons. In this transition from what Dave is talking about to this longer range, which is going to require a lot of experimentation, this is just a hypothesis. No one has an answer for this. But the Chinese theory of victory is you will have what they call a systems confrontation, a collision between an American battle network and a Chinese anti-access area denial network. That collision will start early, and it will probably determine the outcome of the campaign. And the Chinese theory of victory is system destruction warfare. Nothing that I can find says, hey, you need to sink a certain number of American ships or shoot down a certain number of American airplanes or kill a number of tanks. It is attack the American battle network at all levels, relentlessly, and they practice it all the time. Meanwhile, on our side, whenever we have an exercise and when the Red Force really kind of destroys our command and control, we stop the exercise and say, okay, let's restart, and read, "Don't be so bad," and allow us to practice the American way of war, because, after all, we're pretty good at it. So the first thing we have to do is we have to win the system destruction warfare fight, both against a Chinese adversary or a Russian adversary. We know we're going to have to fight from longer range in many cases, and we know that we're going to have forces inside their guided munitions regime, guided munitions envelope. And just as we tried to work it out in the 1950s, it will require distributed operations. You're going to have to disaggregate your force so that your forces are not massed and will be able to survive under persistent guided munitions bombardment. When I first heard it just as kind of a throwaway in the unclassified version of the NDS, and it talks about the new global operating model, and so they say there'll be a contact layer, a blunt layer, a surge layer, and a homeland defense layer. And when Chris first told me about it, I didn't like it at all. I said, hey, this sounds to me a lot like Rapid Halt in 1983. What's the difference? But the more I thought about it, I said, this could be a way to really force change on the services and get new operational concepts. And I'll give an example. The Marines really see themselves as a blunt surge force. In other words, you have the Muse out there, they're in the contact layer, but they're really to kind of do the part of the blunt, and then you assemble two big Marine Expeditionary Brigades in 38 amphibious ships, and you get them across the beach. But if the Marines started thinking themselves more as the contact blunt force, which I think a lot of what Noel Williams talks about, you wind up with an entirely different Marine Corps. You don't need a huge amphibious fleet. You might have more Blume machine combat teams that you can insert inside the guided munitions envelope and really do some things that would screw up an adversary. So I think this contact blunt surge would be an interesting thing to try to force change on the force services and have OSD say, come up and tell me how you envision yourself in these layers and how would you contribute to a campaign, and you might get some very interesting stuff.
Chris?
I think what's interesting here is the commonality between, much of what Bob is talking about it's extant today in theories and concept, and it's being developed, but the ideas, the solutions are out in the 10 years and beyond, oftentimes 20 years for some of the stuff. And I think Dave is much more focused on things that can be done within a FIDEP or passable or two at the most. But the common themes are the difficulties of gaining and maintaining sufficient information. We used to call it dominance. I think that's probably unrealistic against a pure adversary. I think it's but a sufficient advantage in the information domain because as when Bob described that shift that we had from mass to precision, where precision relies on information, relies on knowing where things are, being able to transmit that information quickly and accurately to a weapon system or a platform, and then have that platform attack it, and then know that that target was actually successfully attacked. And if you look at what China and Russia are doing, they're attempting at as Bob described and as Dave described, doing everything they can to deny us that ability and to destroy our systems. And I think that's one reason why the NDS focused so much on resilience of our C4ISR. We have designed our C4ISR systems around efficiency of cost and efficiency of information transfer. And I think we've realized that focus on efficiency and that area has made us vulnerable to attack. But when you're not under attack from an Iran or North Korea or an Iraq, it doesn't really matter that your space architecture is vulnerable, because it's not. Nobody's going to attack it. I think the second thing I would go to is that, and Bob alludes to this with the disaggregation, and that's logistics, right? So if we are going to fight as a transoceanic power projection force, there is no getting around the need to move people, material, munitions, munitions, fuel, and other critical end items to wherever you're going to fight. And the more disaggregated you fight, the more difficult that becomes. We build big main operating bases not because we like to have big main operating bases, because that's an efficient way to operate, particularly for air operations, right? It's just much more efficient to concentrate. But what you've done is created a large concentrated target. And how do we figure out the logistical pathway to getting toward from where we're talking about today, where it's possibly tractable, to the future where it may not be tractable, is really some of where the rubber meets the road in these concepts, I think, in those two particular areas. And the last I would say is it's in the aerospace realm, a lot of it. I think every domain faces its own challenges, but I think that the Chinese and Russian almost laser-like focus on denying us an ability to establish some form of aerospace dominance in the theater of operations is particularly problematic, because that, I think, is the sine qua non of every U.S. operation since the tail end of World War II. I mean, there's always that quote that's been since 1953, since U.S. ground forces came under a concerted air attack, although I know that there's been recent drone attacks in the Middle East, and then you can quibble with whether that qualifies or not. But I think that notion that really since the end of World War II, U.S. ground forces haven't been under adversary air attack of any particular consequence really strikes home the fact that that's not going to be the case anymore. And so how do you think about operating in a completely different way now that we can't guarantee that to a joint force commander any longer?
Yeah. So, Chris, as you point out, there's a lot of agreement happening up here right now, which is, lovely and delightful, but doesn't make for a particularly spicy panel. And so what I'm going to try now is try to get you to disagree a little bit, and I'm going to do that in the traditional way that reasonable people are caused to disagree, and that is by trying to apply a resource constraint to the conversation here, right? Yeah. And so all three of you mentioned lots of very expensive things. Bob on the end is talking about pretty substantial investments in artificial intelligence and autonomy, human-machine teaming, things of that nature. Dave kind of implied in your comments are certain advanced munitions. Mm-hmm. What would you like to add to that, to your Christmas list?
So I'll answer that question and also foil your attempt to get us to disagree. So Rand. So
excited to lead at that.
Yeah. I've had enough. So 2 years ago, I was asked to lead a project that looked back at 15 years of wargaming. And the headline of that was, we're 0 for 18. And General Hicks, who was the Air Force strategy lead on the Air Staff, I want to say he loved to quote that. He didn't love it. He hated the fact that we were 0 for 18 in these war games against our most competitive adversaries. But that was the reality. Following that, he said, okay, I'm tired of playing these war games where we learn the same lesson over and over again, that the program of record fails. Build me a force that will not fail, that will underwrite a better operational concept, better way of war. We did that. To our surprise, we found it impossible to spend more than $8 billion a year to make the Air Force ready to deal with these problems. So multiply that by 3. For $24 billion a year, I will assert that if we focus that on the right stuff, we can move the needle against China and Russia. And the right stuff would be standoff weapons and munitions, like JASSM-ER. So we shouldn't get into brand names, but anti-armor munitions, posture changes, right? We don't have enough stuff in Europe. Let's just admit it. I need armor brigades, I need fires brigades, I need weapons and munitions, I need short-range air defenses for my army and my air bases, anti-satellite weapons, jam-resistant data links, SAM suppression missiles. I can buy the whole kit, and it's all mature technologies. And it would scare the crap out of our adversaries. Yeah. In a good way.
So it would scare the crap out of our adversaries in this like 5 to 10 year time horizon that we've been talking about. But where do you wedge in Bob's investments in the future to deal with challenges 20, 25 years out? I hazard that's going to be more than $24 billion a year.
Well, so I think I read yesterday that our R&D budget for FY20 is going to be $110 billion a year. I repeat, $110 billion a year. I think with some smart management, you could get plenty of oomph against the things you most want for the third offset, the 2030-ish kinds of capabilities that we need to keep ahead of a dynamic adversary.
Well, maybe you have, because I would like to take issue here.
Oh, right.
You have to make a judgment on your strategic competitors. Are they looking for a fight? If they're looking for a fight and looking for a way to incur a defeat on the United States, then I would say, sure, $24 billion a year for the next 5 years would be a good expenditure. But I believe both China and Russia are conventionally deterred. That is why in the Cold War, with the forces in Europe right up against each other, the competition went out of area in proxy wars. Now it's going more in the terms of gray zone competition, below the level of overt military competition. I think we needed to improve readiness. That was a righteous, near-term focus, but I would actually take risk right now and put more money into pursuing advanced capabilities and asking the services to do more to pursue what we would call new operational and organizational constructs, new operational concepts and new organizations. And I'm heartened that we're spending $110 billion on R&D. That is awesome.
We're asking for.
So that's totally awesome. And I think we're spending on the order of $200 billion in modernization. That's awesome. And there's all sorts of things that are going on. You just probably read yesterday, Kratos is coming out with this attritable, low-cost drone. Boeing is going after a loyal unmanned wingman. The Navy just announced that they're going to have an unmanned surface ship on contract by the end of the year. The Navy has just bought 4 extra large diameter or huge diameter, whatever they're calling them now, huge diameter UUVs. So there's a lot of stuff going on. But the thing that's missing are really experiments on new operational concepts and organizational constructs. And so that's where I put my money in that right away. And the place where Dave and I agree is spend a lot more money on munitions than you're spending right now. Get your munition stocks up and take a real hard look at some of the things in the program and get rid of them and go after these large things. We're not that much of a disagreement. I just take a little bit more risk probably in the near term.
I think I would place and obviously it's the theme of the project, but I would place a greater emphasis, I think, on ensuring that we have a workable concept first. I think within the 5-year time frame, you're somewhat limited in the stuff you can buy simply by what exists and what is on the shelf and what is out there and budgetary constraints. So I don't want to at all say that the sorts of things that Dave is talking about aren't absolutely critical, because they were things that we recommended as part of the National Defense Strategy. So those things are all excellent, but I do think that there comes a breaking point, and I think I'll use an example of air-based defense as kind of a good example, right? Ultimately, we're in a long-term competition between the adversary's long-range missiles and our ability to shoot down or defend ourselves passively against those missiles, and whether they're ballistic or cruise or now increasingly hypersonic, the competition there just doesn't look good for the defender. Mm-hmm. And so while there are things we can do in the 5 to 10 year time frame to make those issues better, and in particular investing in better cruise missile defense being kind of one of them, long term, that competition in that kind of first island chain, second island chain area, or in Central and Western Europe, just doesn't look good for the side that relies on air bases to create aerospace power. And the same thing applies in space. If you're the power that relies on space for your long-range C-4 for ISR, you are disadvantaged because objects in space are incredibly vulnerable and sensitive to interference. And so how do we get around the fact that in the near term our investments are going to be in marginal improvements or differentiations of those systems against the world that Bob, I think, is postulating, in which those things may not be useful whatsoever. And the question is, would we be investing in things over the next 5 to 10 years that in 20 years we're saying, gee, I wish I'd bought something else because now I'm not even going to have something that looks like a main forward operating airbase. I'm going to have something radically different. We don't know quite what that is yet, but perhaps we need to figure it out.
Yeah. Excellent way to resolve the conflict here.
So can I just have a
Of course.
So I am guilty of going to the hardware first, and all this stuff that I mentioned and more that was on our list is only useful to the extent that it underwrites a new concept of operations that allows you to, in fact, reach into that contested zone and kill stuff from the outset of the campaign. So I don't disagree at all that the concept has to be guiding what you buy, but you can't actually enable what I believe is the future concept without buying the stuff to make it feasible. And you need to do it judiciously so that if you got a 20-year shelf life on this stuff, you believe it will still have relevance in the world of 2040, when admittedly both the adversary and us will have a whole new generation of stuff coming online.
And this is why the upgradability of systems really matters, right?
Yeah.
There's got to be a path to getting that system to the next generation so that we can take it, improve it, and make it ready for the era of algorithmic warfare as we move into the future. I think I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. So I do want to save some time for the audience to ask questions, but first, sorry, Sydney. But first, I do have one final question for the panel here, and that's how are we going to get to the future that we've just spent the last 45 minutes describing, right? Is change going to be evolutionary? Is it more revolutionary? Does it need to be driven from the top down? Do we expect more of a bottom up generated kind of answer to this set of problems that we've presented here today? How do we get there? I think I'll start with Bob.
Well, there's always a combination of top-down, bottom-up. At this point of time, I think a more impetus from top-down is necessary because there are choices being made that may not support the long-range kind of operational concepts. As we're spending money on experiments and prototyping and doing war games and trying to do this, Dave has convinced me that to really jumpstart this, you give a specific goal that the joint force must accomplish. And so, based on all the war games, and the numbers are not exact because the exact numbers are classified, but I'll just give you the thing. Joint force, I'm going to withhold $24 billion over the fit-up. You have to show me how we kill 350 PLAN ships and PLA Coast Guard ships in 72 hours, whether they're in harbor, in a tunnel, on or under the sea.
In the first 72 hours.
In the first 72 hours.
Right.
That's your goal. And any of the services that come in with an operational concept that get us closer to that will be given the money at the end of the build to go after the concepts and the programs you have. In Europe, it would be, we must kill 2,400 armored vehicles in the first 72 hours. Tell me how you're going to do that. I agree with Dave. Those two sound hard, and they are hard, but they're possible. They're possible with stuff that's on the drawing boards right now. And my argument would be it would underride conventional deterrence both in the Western Pacific and in Europe, and it would force operational concepts. In other words, don't wait for the operational concepts. Give goals to the joint force that they have to solve, and I guarantee you that will generate operational concepts. I would withhold money at the beginning of the program build, whatever it might be, at least 10% of R&D and procurement, and the services that come in with the most with the best operational concepts, after you do the review and you agree to what they have done with the money that was allocated at the beginning of the program build, you say, Army, that is a cool way to kill 2,400 tanks. You're going to get $17 billion over the FIDIP to go after only the stuff that you said you would need to use this. And I would go to Congress and say, you must get rid of unfunded priority lists. That is the killer for any top-down guidance, because any of the services can go to the Congress and say, look, if we only had another $10 billion, we would have bought all these really cool armored Humvees.
That are built in your district.
Unfunded priority lists really hurt you in a period of transformational change like this. You have to enforce discipline on the program.
Dave?
I see Mark in the background. I'll wait to see whether he agrees with me or not.
I think Bob's exactly right. You're not going to have some bearded civilian in OSD come up with new ways to kill tanks. I mean, we have ideas about it, but at the end of the day, innovation at the operational level is the birthright of the services. They're the professionals and they know how to do this, but they have to be given the right incentives and strong leadership. So the leadership has a vision, it states goals, it has the discipline to hold people to the achievement of those goals. The incentive comes from providing money to the winners, not saying, congratulations, you just came up with a brilliant new concept for killing tanks in the Baltics, take the money out of your own hide. That's guaranteed to fail. That and a partnership with Congress so that you can get support for these politically painful changes in the way we do business, I think is the way we're going to get there.
And I'll give Chris the last word.
Yeah, I think I keep coming back. One of the coolest moments of the NDS process was actually after the NDS had been released, and I went to War on the Rocks, and I read this piece in War on the Rocks about war bots, and it had been written by a handful of mid-career junior officers in the Marine Corps about how the Marine Corps could use unmanned systems and man-unmanned teaming in the littorals to form kind of a hybrid of a contact and blunt layer like Bob talked about. And it was this really cool moment because you're coming up with these ideas in the National Defense Strategy and you're banding them about and you're hoping, like, does this land with someone and does somebody out there hear this and get it and go take it and run with it? And it was clear to me in seeing that, like, holy Moses, somebody did. They took it and ran with it. They made some cool ideas, and I think that's great. So I think that gets to the, how do you start fomenting the bottom-up concept development? Because Dave is completely right. It's not going to come from folks like me. It's going to come from folks inside the services, like those Marine officers. I think the phrase I've been using in my mind is kind of a guided adhocracy, right? You create a target, you create this idea of what it is you want to go do, and then you let the smart folks who are capable of doing it without reaching into them bureaucratically, but simply saying, look, this is the thing you want to go do, and if you go do this, there's going to be some good things that happen, and reward the people who do good work inside it. The one place that I think it gets a little problematic is that Dave is totally right. The concepts, the good ones, are going to come from the services. The problem is warfare is increasingly and inherently joint. Mm-hmm. And so finding a way to stitch together these diverse concepts from each service to something that is more than the sum of its constituent parts is going to be incredibly difficult. And I think it's going to be hard for people, whether it's in OSD, the Joint Staff, or in Congress, to judge the merits of service investments or service concepts until they understand how all of these fit together into a larger war-winning idea. And I think that's the key part for me, is how do we get from that step where you're going to have service-driven ideas, because I do think that is probably in all likelihood the interim step, right? It's not going to become some sort of grand theory of everything. You're going to have to do the hard work at the end, and it's going to be somewhat evolutionary probably at first at the service level, but to something that creates a revolutionary impact when you put it all together.
I noticed you didn't say GIFCOM.
Yeah.
If GIFCOM is the answer, it was the wrong question. It has to come out of the services.
Okay. Well, in the spirit of guided adhocracy, I'm going to turn it over to the audience. I'm just going to stand so I can see everybody. And Sydney, here, first question.
Sidney Friedberg breaking defense. So we have gone through a great discussion of what we want to do and that we have to make hard choices, but not what the hard choices necessarily are, except for maybe readiness cuts. This budget looks like it's cutting a carrier overhaul, so that's 25 carriers out of the force, maybe 20 if you tweak the reactor a little bit. We're buying F-15 super whatevers, as well as stealth fighters. Army is moving $30 billion out of legacy programs, sounds like primarily upgrades to things like CH-47, M1, M2 in favor of all new stuff. Are those the right hard choices or a down payment on the right hard choices? What stuff would you guys kill to fund the stuff you need? If you were king / murderous assassin for the day, what would you cut?
Well, so we're not programmers. It's easy to sit up here and play that game. The reality is that the program of each of the services is so complex. There are thousands of invisible lines in there that can be used to find money when you need to find money. If the service chief says to his programmer, I need $8 billion at the no kidding level of life to buy this stuff, they know how to do that. So just, and let me just offer that. I think in the long term, things that sail on the surface of the ocean in general are going to have a hard time in this environment. Things that rely on sophisticated base infrastructures like runways and fuel tanks are going to have a hard time in this environment. Not everything our force does is going to be in the A2AD environment, so we've got to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. There is still a role for legacy platforms, but if you can't get the delta to the top line that you need to buy the stuff to address A2AD, then you've got to look at some of those kinds of trade-offs.
Yeah, your question comes just a little bit soon. I think the budget drops on Monday. And
all of the things I said are true.
Well, that's true. But the budget, we've been promised that the masterpiece will be revealed in the 2020 budget.
Yeah.
And I have heard things that may be in the budget, but I just don't know. Some of the things say, hey, that's really cool, and some of the things say, oh, that's really a bummer. But to a point, you got to look at the strategy. If you looked at the strategy right now and said, hey, we have 58 brigade combat teams in the Army, and we have 54 tactical fighter squadrons in the Air Force, and there is no way that I can square that with the strategy. There's just no way I can square it. So I would say, look, we seem to be in this strategy below the level of aerospace power we need to execute the strategy. And it appears to me we might have too much capacity on ground forces. It appears. Now, again, I've been out of this now for almost 2 years, so I haven't seen anything. But, for example, in the Army, we're going to buy 504 light tanks. Huh? Tell me how the 504 light tanks fit within this construct. There's an insurgency in the Marine Corps right now, and they say, look, we got to quit spending all this money on these high-end, exquisite amphibious ships. We have to go to a whole new way of thinking about maneuvering Marine forces in this very contested environment, and there's all sorts of ideas to do it. I would love to hear them, and I would say, okay, how do we do the transition? Now, I've heard that 2 LPDs got cut, so maybe that transition is occurring. I don't know.
They're cut.
So that would be interesting. Right now, the technological threat against aircraft carriers is growing, without question. I think everybody agrees with it. The only thing they don't agree is whether or not the defenses and the tactical techniques and procedures would allow you to operate safely in this very contested environment. So from what I understand, you buy 2 carriers, you chop a RCOH, you keep the carrier forces around 10, which was the number that Bob Gates said, let's go for a carrier force and see how the competition unfolds over decades. That seems right to me. So, and then I heard the Air Force is going to get rid of B-2 and B-1 bombers. And I'm sitting here going, this is where jointness kills you. If you went to the Navy and said kill 350 ships in 72 hours, they would most likely do it through a combination of undersea systems and aerospace systems, air systems. I mean, if the Air Force is getting rid of the B-1 bomber, I said, you are out of maritime strike. We're going to give the B-1 to the U.S. Navy. We're going to load up with 3,000 LRASMs, and we're going to base them in Guam and, and all over the place. And in the first 72 hours, they are going to go out and hunt down and kill every ship in sight. And in other words, give the whole Chinese anti-access area denial network no targets to shoot at. That's why I say what Dave has said after watching 18 years of war games and saying these two operational goals are doable. Yes, they are, but it would require the Navy to go back to what they called in World War II VPB, Patrol Bomber Squadrons, rather than just VP, Patrol Squadrons. But jointness, you would say, oh no, the Air Force has to be able to do all the long-range air. No, they don't. In this transformational change, we can't use jointness as a monolithic cudgel.
It's not a goal.
It's not a goal. It's how do you solve the operational problem? So if the Navy came in and said, hell, I can do it. Give me some long-range bombers and I'll go out and clean the seas. Well, that sounds pretty good to me. You get $24 billion. So we can't, until I see the actual choices, go for longer range, go for distributed operations, distributed logistics, really look at electric weapons. The one thing that could change this balance right now is if you could, right now it's offensive dominant, so electric weapons like high-powered microwaves, lasers, electromagnetic railguns, they have the potential, I'm not ready to push the I believe button, but they could allow you to get surface forces into the Western Pacific and potentially operate off of bases in Europe if they work, because they have deep magazines, high rates of fire, etc. So, as I said, I'm kind of a glass half full guy. And right now, there's a lot of things going on. What I'm most frustrated on is the lack of new organizational constructs that would say, okay, we are changing the force.
Chris, do you want to take a bite of this one?
I'll go really quick because those were great answers. I would just say the big thing that I would whack out are the arbitrary numerical targets: 355 ships, 386 operational squadrons. Yeah. I think those are just, they do so much harm. I think the world in which we lived in the past was, let's buy a system, regardless of whether we actually put all the full capabilities on, all the countermeasures, all the weapon systems, and we can actually load it out with munitions, right? And we'll just have a ship hull that looks, it counts to our ship count, but it isn't actually really an operational capability, or an aircraft that isn't really an operational squadron. I think that thinking has to go away. I think we have to think in terms of what is the actual warfighting outcome that I'm buying by purchasing this system, and have I bought all of the requisite end items that go along with it when it comes to sensors, when it comes to countermeasures, when it comes to weapons, when it comes to the basing infrastructure that it needs to live on, and think holistically like that, and kind of get away from the numerical targets.
So halfway up the aisle here on the right side.
Hi, my name is Price Floyd, CNAS OG, version 1, and former head of public affairs at the Pentagon. I was struck by your opening statements and where someone said if you went home, you talked to your parents or your siblings and you explained to them, where we are, they wouldn't understand what you're talking about because we've been dominant for 25 years. And so my question is, as you put together this new construct, are you thinking about how to get buy-in? Because I think in the past, you could have this discussion here. You could then go have it with people in the building and on the Hill. And if they agreed, you could implement it. But I think those days are gone. And the American people have a say in a way they just didn't before. They kind of let Washington do its thing and they were okay with it. But I'm not sure they're so okay anymore. So what do you do even if you get buy-in from the building and the Hill, but the American people send new folks here who don't want to do this?
I think one thing that's really striking to me is the consistency from the past two political administrations. I know that sounds odd to say, but both President Obama and President Trump have more or less said something along the lines of, we need to move away from nation building abroad and toward nation building at home. And I think that reflects a larger pulse among the American people. I don't think that's an outlier. I know when I've talked to my family who, that does not live in the Beltway, they ask me about the strategy, they ask me about the bill that comes along with it, and they usually said something along the lines of, you're kidding me, you're asking me for $750 billion, you're telling me that we might lose a war. And I kind of shrink back and say, yeah, that's true. And I feel a little bit sheepish. With that being said, I think there are ways of making the point to the American public in ways that perhaps we haven't before. If I had a perfect solution to give you, I would give it right now. I do think that just writing papers that we circulate amongst ourselves is probably not the way to do it.
Yeah.
I think, I love talking to all of you, and this is all fantastic, but I do know that there's nobody in, or very likely, very few people in Des Moines, Iowa, or Tacoma, Washington, who are listening to what I'm saying right now. And that, I think, has to change. The question is, what do we use to change that? I think there are multiple ways. I mean, I remember, and I'm sure many here do as well, the impact that Tom Clancy's novels had on the broader American public's understanding of the potentials of warfare with the Soviet Union in the 1980s. I think something like that, where it popularizes that kind of like military techno thriller that was kind of very common in that period of time. I think something like that reprised for this era. I know Ghost Fleet started that ilk, but more could certainly be necessary to get it into the American public's head that, like, no, this is the image of conflict you have in your mind's eye, which is the Iraqi AAA blindly spraying the sky looking for the stealth fighters, isn't what warfare is going to look like. And the American people need to come to grips with what that may be. And I'm sure there are probably, books are terribly outdated. I know there's probably some much more relevant, Twitter campaign we could launch, but I think getting outside of what we do traditionally, because it's clearly not working.
To me, the center of gravity is Congress. The Office of Net Assessment, working with RAND, made what was called the Overmatch Brief. And what it did is it took a look at what was happening in the Western Pacific and what was happening in the along the Balts, etc. And it just, in a very pictorial way, said, our overmatch is gone, and look at this. And it's not the American people. When Senator McCain saw this, he said, I want every single person on the SASC and the HASC to see this brief. We actually went over and gave it. And the members of Congress who were on the House Armed Services Committee and the SASC, they were shocked. They were going, holy moly, I didn't have any idea it was this bad. So before we go and try to convince the American people, we have to convince Congress that the administration and Congress need to work together to affect this broad transformation to allow us to regain some measure of overmatch. And so I'd be interested in the guys who are on the SASC and the HASC, but I was there when we were briefing the overmatch, and I was surprised at the reaction we were getting, where people who were actually supposed to know. I remember one member, the briefer used the term C4ISR. And this is a member on the HASC said, what is C4ISR? And that's when I went, whoa, we've got a lot further to go convincing Congress we need to change ourselves.
Although admittedly part of that is the military's love for
Sydney, hang on. Wait to be called on, please. Dave, do you have anything to chip in on this one? Okay. Let's go second from the front of the aisle here.
Hi, Chip Gregson, lazy retiree, and this has been a great discussion, and you quite properly put the onus on the services to explain their strategic concept and how they're going to organize to fulfill that strategic concept. Let me take a contemporary problem and ask about an agency. Something that could kill North Korean missiles over North Korea would be a terrific deterrent at the moment. Indeed. Do you include MDA in your possible candidate for your mythical $24 billion?
Yes, is a short answer. Yeah, boost phase intercept looks like it could be a real winner in Korea.
But no service owns it.
Correct. Well,
Well, this is the way I would answer that. Under the roles and missions, the U.S. Army has the responsibility for air-based defense. And if we went to war in Europe, there would be one Patriot battery moving, and it would go to Ramstein, and that's it. So this goes back to my my comment that we have 58 brigade combat teams, but we don't have anything to protect our bases. So what difference does it make?
or our brigade combat team.
Yeah.
From Russian helicopters, from Russian UAVs, from Russian fixed-wing aviation.
Not protecting an ally.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's the burst radius of a nuke is a little bigger than.
Yeah. Could be protecting ourselves as well.
Yeah, about 3 years ago.
Which is why I'm saying we're close to being able to achieve boost phase intercept, and unless you believe in Santa Claus coming out of Hanoi, it's going to be a need here real quickly.
Yeah, 3 years ago, Jim Searing came to the Department of Defense and said, look, we were born as an R&D agency. We've become a procurement agency. We see what is happening with the threat. We want to now shift focus to the threats coming down the line and come up with both operational concepts and capabilities to address that threat. So that was 3 years ago. I would assume that is continuing apace. I don't know.
So just on the aisle here in yellow tie.
Thank you. Great discussion, and thanks to CNS for hosting this. I'm Bruce McDonald, Johns Hopkins SICE and former Senior Director for Science and Technology on the Clinton NSC staff. A quick comment and a question. Quick comment is in this additional funding, and I'm glad to hear about $110 billion, but my experience is that one thing that's gotten short shrift a lot over the last 20 years is 6162 R&D funding. Not a lot of money, but as a percentage of the budget, it just keeps going down and down and down. So that gave us, the internet and a whole lot of other things. So don't forget that. My question is, in all this discussion, maybe just once did I hear anything about allies? And so my question is, excellent points made. We can get, very joint perhaps, but how does the jointness and these great ideas you're kicking around, how do we interact with our allies on that? And also, just as a point of comparison, we do have the inherent strength that we have a lot of allies, sometimes more than we need, but China and Russia are notably deficient in that, and I hope that gives us some strengths or advantage here. I mean, I feel like you're war games. I want to go home and have a few drinks after taking you guys too seriously. But anyway, so I toss that out to you, and I'd love to hear your comments.
Yeah. Absolutely right, Bruce.
Yeah, so I was going to say, so two things. One, there's no more clear statement of U.S. defense strategy since the end of World War II, which is that it relies on a constellation of allies and partners and an ability to project power globally, right? The two go hand in glove. They exist together. Our allies and partners extend our influence across the globe, and they provide basing, access, and forces when we go to fight. And our power projection capability deters threats and helps defend them in the case of aggression against them. And those two things work synergistically, and they've worked synergistically very well for the last 70 years. And hopefully they'll work very well synergistically for the next 70 years. And I think part of this project is getting us to a place where the latter half of that, because obviously our focus is on warfare, at least in my part of the project, still functions, right? Our ability to project power or to use military force to help protect our allies and partners overseas. With that being said, that in itself, just inside the Department of Defense, is an incredibly complex task. And as we were talking about earlier, right, we may have to aim for joint concepts but end up at service concepts that are eventually then congregated. Adding in allies and partners to that, I think, at least my decision was very early on, it's going to be a little bit complicated, but over time, as our concepts begin to grow, building out the American way of war so that it now becomes a coalition way of war that we do together. But I mean, if you look back at the development of air-land battle, for example, air-land battle comes and then you get NATO follow-on forces attack, right? But you've got to have something that you then build out and and share with the allies and partners. And I think that's the first focus. I think phase 2 obviously would move on to that coalition effort.
Just at the operational level, there's a lot of unexploited potential that the allies could exploit by doing more. It's a couple of simple examples. Shallow water mines and short-range anti-ship cruise missiles in Taiwan can make it much harder for China to achieve its objectives and much easier for us to sink that 350 ship. Unattended ground sensors that we're using in Afghanistan that cost almost nothing in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia can give us a marvelous sensing network to help defend against and they're not high-tech, they're not expensive. We just need to identify these things and encourage our allies to start fielding them.
So second from the back in the purple shirt.
Yes, my question.
Just the microphone, please, and please identify yourself.
Peter Wilson, Rand Corporation. Bob, the question I have to you about the third offset, what I find troubling about the concept, unlike nuclear weapons or our 25, 30-year monopoly in reconnaissance strike capabilities, which we have used effectively, is that many of the elements of the third offset, artificial intelligence, robotics, etc., are globalized, and that the Chinese and others, and also, for example, in the area of robotics, this arms race between IT and the automotive industry to produce autonomous vehicles, is unclear to me how the U.S. maintains a comparative military advantage in these domains when, in fact, we may not actually have really significant technological superiority.
It's a great question. When Secretary Mattis came in and he said, come and talk to me about third offset, and he goes, that's not a strategy. And I go, sir, I disagree, it is a strategy. And he go, but I said, it is a competitive strategy. It's a temporal competitive strategy. We have to have objectives in the FIDP, we have to have objectives in the second and third FIDP, and we have to have objectives in the fourth FIDP and beyond. And how you phase, I would argue is a strategy. He doesn't agree. He said, I don't agree. I will refer to this as the third offset program, but I won't refer to it as strategy. And I said, you are the boss. So this is it's much different than the Cold War, where we knew we had a technological superiority, and the entire basis of the second offset assumed we would maintain that authority over time, superiority over time, and the Soviet Union simply would not be able to compete with us, and they were correct. We can't make that assumption anymore. So this is a really hot competition, and that's why Sydney's written several articles in the last couple days. I'm sure the Russians and Chinese are heartened that we're going after AI for predictive maintenance and firefighting. I'm sure they are entirely heartened because we are trying to explain to the American people, this is where we will have to go to the American people and say, no, AI-enabled autonomous weapons will be more discriminating on the battlefield. They're totally congruent with laws of war. They're more ethical. Tell me why you were worried about them. And of course, they're worried about Terminators. And I can give the long story on how this came about. But the Department of Defense has no intention that I know of, certainly no intention when I was talking about third offset, to go after what is now called a lethal autonomous weapon system, where the weapon system itself decides what target to attack. What commander would want that weapon? Because the law of war says that distinction and proportionality are on the commander's head, not the weapon. So the commander who uses a lethal autonomous weapon system that chooses its own target, the commander is delegating his free will, he's delegating his culpability for a law of war violation to a free-willed machine. I've never talked to any commander in the West who said, hey, that's a real good idea. We will use artificial narrow intelligence to make weapons more discriminating. And I think where our advantage is, Pete, is a system of systems of human-machine collaboration and combat teaming where we may be able to prevail. But man, this is like game on. This is totally game on.
This is going to be the last question. You've already had one, Sydney. Right, second row right here in the aisle.
Zach Biggs, I'm a reporter with the Center for Public Integrity. So I wanted to ask, given that technological advantage is not as clear or absolute as it might have historically been, the past 25 years we had this level of dominance which is a bit of an anomaly. It's not a historically consistent level of capability. When we're talking about a new concept, what are we striving for? Are we striving to somehow recreate that level of dominance despite the difficulties with the technology competition? Are we just looking for a minor edge so that we can win a conflict? What's the level of capability that we hope this future concept can achieve?
Yeah.
Which one? You want to go
I'm going to give you the last word, Chris. David,
Okay.
go ahead.
So, yeah, it's unrealistic to expect that we will ever enjoy against Russia and China the degree of dominance we had against the junior varsity, the Iraqs, the Serbias, the Afghanistans of the world. Forget about it. What is realistic is that we can create operational problems that Russia and China cannot solve in their aggression. So I may not have air superiority over the battle space in the opening week of the war. Some of my satellites are going to get broken. I'm going to be under jamming attack, etc. But that will not prevent me from reaching into the contested zone and going after his operational center of gravity. That's doable.
And this goes back to Pete's question. I think the one advantage that the U.S. has shown is the ability to rather quickly, and from a historical perspective, go from operational concept to all of the things you have to do to actually make it real. The training, the exercising, all of that. The example I use is the Army says, I think in 1975, we want to own the night. And if all it was go out and buy a bunch of NVGs, night vision goggles, well, we could own the night, in 2 years. But that's not what allowed the Army to own the night. They had to train all their squad leaders on how to take care, how to be quiet at night. They had to train all their forces. How do you operate where your peripheral vision isn't very good? What type of control measures do you have? What type of command and control do you That was a 10-year process. By 1985, the Army owned the night. But it wasn't like it's the competitor who can put all these technological things together. And the other example, of course, is Blitzkrieg. Everybody knew there was mechanization. Everyone knew that aviation was exploding. Everyone knew about the radio. But only the Germans put it together into an operational concept that gave them an advantage on the battlefield. That's where I think the United States has its competitive advantage. And that's why all of us, I think, are so frustrated. Where are these operational concepts? We want to see them. And perhaps they're being made in the back room. I don't know. But hopefully we'll get on towards them quickly.
Chris, last word.
Yeah, so it's kind of a hybrid answer to the two questions because I think they're interrelated. I think first, United States, with kind of marginal exceptions, we're largely a status quo power. We've got an international order that we set up, 70 odd years ago, and we'd like to more or less keep things as it is, as they are, because it's been working out pretty well for us for the last 70 odd years. And I think China in particular wants to change certainly the character of that order, and if not, build a new one, at least replace us as the center of the order and make it more to their interests. And I think the good thing about that situation is it does afford us the strategic defensive, and it affords us in many cases the operational defensive as well, which is advantageous in some ways. And I think what that allows you to do is adopt a strategy or a posture that really what you're focused on doing is every morning of every day, your opposite side in the enemy country wakes up and says, I'm not going to do this today. This isn't going to work. And it just goes on in perpetuity like that. And I think the question, and I think a lot of people are grappling with this, is, okay, that's great. You've done that in the military sphere, right? Every day, every morning of every day, they say, no, I can't do this. There's a whole other host of government and other spaces, whether it's diplomatic, economic. I got all that, right? I mean, understood, but we're here to solve the M problem of the dime issue. But I think that is a doable thing, as I think both Dave and Bob have laid out. When it comes to how do we get there, and what does this proliferation of technology mean? I would come to two things, two examples from history. One is the dreadnought question, right? And this gets to the AI point. After the Battle of Tsushima Strait, right, everybody realized that an all big gun battleship was just going to be so qualitatively superior to the mixed gun battleships that had preceded it that everybody was going out and going to design something like the dreadnought. But it was up to the British to make the very, very dangerous, what seemed very dangerous, very risky decision to build a battleship that in its own existence obsolesced the entire rest of their previously dominant battle fleet. But you had to do it because if you didn't, somebody else, the Germans were sure as heck going to do it, and you needed to do it first because you needed to gain that advantage. And so I think we can't just wish away artificial intelligence or autonomy because we don't want to do it and we like the way we do things nowadays. It's coming whether we like it or not, because our adversaries sure as heck aren't going to wish it away. And then I think Bob made the perfect point about World War II and the Blitzkrieg, right? What matters is the ability to look with a very clear eye at the problem, understand what it is, break it down into its constituent parts, and work very hard at solving that problem analytically, wargaming it, and then going out and exercising it with actual systems and saying, did what my analysis told me and my wargame told me actually work in the field, and then come back, do your analysis again, and do your wargaming again, and keep on going with that cycle of research until you get to an answer that seems reasonable.
Bob has something to add.
I feel like I have to say this before we go. Because we all work in the wargaming space, sometimes we use the word adversary when we're talking about Russia and China. But if you look at the U.S. national security strategy as well as the national defense strategy, nowhere will you say that we designate China and Russia as strategic adversaries. We say they are geopolitical rivals or strategic competitors. And we are not the Department of Defense, Department of War. We're the Department of Defense. All of this thinking is to make sure we never cross swords with another great power. So I think we all use the word adversary at different times today. I just want to make sure that you don't think that CNAS has declared China and Russia as adversaries. They're strategic competitors that we have to keep our eyes on, and I just wanted to say that before we broke.
That's a great place to end. The goal here is actually to keep the peace. It's to never have to fight another great power war. That's what we're all trying to do. Thanks to our panelists. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. Appreciate it.